Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien yet again, and welcome to the video quiz for Key Concept 5.3. And remember, period 5 covers the years 1844 to 1877, more or less. Pre-Civil War, Civil War, Reconstruction. So let's get started. 5.3. The Union victory in the Civil War and the contested Reconstruction of the South settled the issues of slavery and secession, but left unresolved many questions about the power of the federal government and citizenship rights. Meaning the Civil War ended slavery, it brought the South gradually back into the Union, but left unresolved questions about the relationship of national versus states' rights, and remember, the South resists any type of racial equality with every fiber of their being, which you will learn about periodically throughout the rest of this year and next year as well. So some of the big idea questions to remember in the back of your mind: why did the North ultimately win the war? How did Reconstruction affect the relationship between Congress and the presidency? And what effect did the 14th and 15th Amendments have on women and African Americans? All right, Roman numeral 1. The North's greater manpower, meaning they had more soldiers, and industrial resources. The North can make stuff quicker. Remember, manufacturing, market revolution. Its leadership, and the decision for emancipation in 1863 eventually led to the Union military victory over the Confederacy in the devastating Civil War. So first things first, the North and the South dedicated their economies and societies to fighting the war. In both the North and the South, you have a draft, a conscription. And this didn't really bode well with a lot of people who were not wealthy, because here's the thing. In the North, if you paid $300, you didn't have to fight in the war. That whole draft thing, forget about it. Doesn't apply to you thanks to your $300. So you can more or less hire a substitute if you can afford $300. And who can afford that better? The wealthy. In the South, you had to own, if you owned a certain number of slaves, since your duties overseeing your plantation were so stressful that you were allowed to not fight in the war. So the elite did not have to more or less fight in the war. I think it was 20 slaves. If you owned 20 more slaves, you didn't have to fight in the war. All right. So opposition on the home front persisted, especially as the war grew on and as conditions domestically got worse for both the North and the South. You know, it isn't that easy getting, in the South at least. Remember, 3 out of 4 people never owned a slave. So you know, how do you get them to fight for a thing they're never going to be really part of, materially speaking? They were never going to own a slave. So that psychological wage that white people were promised down south, those people who never owned a slave. You know, I may be poor, but at least I'm not a slave, at least I'm not black, as the psychological wage went, only went so far. So you had things like bread riots down south during the war, you know, protesting the conditions on the home front. In the North, for example, some of the tension between those who supported the war and those who were against, Maryland newspapers were shut down by Lincoln. You know, Maryland, remember, was a slave state that did not leave the Union. It was a border state. So the Union troops, for example, would have to go through Maryland to get down to the South. It was a pretty half and half, pretty heavily secessionist state, even though it never left the Union. So you would wind up with pro-secessionists sabotaging the Union war effort in the state. So Lincoln has to suspend habeas corpus during the war, or he feels he has to suspend habeas corpus, jailing people who he thought were hurting the war effort, letting them go, well, presumably once the war was over. Habeas corpus being suspended more or less means you can be thrown in jail and never charged with anything, so they can just keep you there indefinitely. We might use the phrase today, indefinite detention, to mean that. Also in the North, in 1863, you have the New York City draft riots by the Irish, those pesky Irish. As depicted in the movie by Martin Scorsese, Gangs of New York, at least the last half hour were the draft riots. And these draft riots also doubled as a race riot. The Irish, notoriously, historically racist. So in New York City, the Irish were competing with free blacks for the worst of the worst jobs. Your native-born Protestants that tended to be your Northern Republicans, pro-Civil War, they tended to either think lowly of or mistreat the Irish. So the Irish view was, hey, why should we go off and fight a war down south when we're fighting a war here in New York City, in the 5 Points? You know, this is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Why should we be there? This isn't our fight. So there was resistance from both the North and the South, periodically, for the war. In the South, many farmers refused to fight. They would not let their slaves fight. Okay. Now, in 1863, and this picture should actually be up a little bit further on the screen here, that should say Effects of the Emancipation Proclamation. Up on the top of the page, it said one of the things that helped the North win the war was emancipation. And think about that. It was kind of a double whammy. 1863, January 1st, Abraham Lincoln declares a lot of slaves to be free, although it didn't really, on a material level, it wasn't like the slave owner said, "Oh, okay, Abe said so. We're going to let you go now." It was in large part a symbolic gesture, but many thousands did either run away or get their freedom as a result of this. But the Emancipation Proclamation more or less, quote-unquote, freed slaves that were behind enemy lines or behind secessionist lines. Basically those who Abe couldn't actually free. But anyway, it was kind of a double whammy. It motivated slaves to in part, it was already being done. I shouldn't say Abe is the reason they ran away. But it was a double whammy. Slaves run away from the plantation. They were used as labor during the war. All of a sudden they can escape the South, go up north, and they can become soldiers in the North. So it's a double whammy. The South loses their labor force in the military effort, and the North gains much-needed soldiers in the war effort. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure, and it was legally allowed under the Constitution because it was a war measure. You know, the Commander-in-Chief can do whatever he or she feels necessary to win at war. Okay? So it was a war measure, why he was able to take away their, quote, property. And again, remember, it was a double whammy. Alright, so now also the purpose of the war has changed in 1863, midway through the war. It isn't just to save the Union, now it is also to free the slaves. Alright, and as I said, many African Americans enlist in the U.S. Army, and it's impossible to overstate this, because if a slave runs away and he picks up a rifle to fight against the South, there is no way you can then ask him to put down the rifle and go back on the plantation once the war is over. What I mean by that is, slavery was a dead dog. You can't ask a man to fight against the South and then to become a slave once the war is over. Alright? And enlisting in the military has this civilizing effect in that it's more difficult to argue that you are unfit to be part of, quote, we the people, if you do that. Alright? So this is a game changer, this Emancipation Proclamation. Alright? It also kept Europeans from siding with the South. The South was always trying to get recognized by nations in Europe, and by making the war also, and the European countries were uncomfortable with the idea of recognizing the South as its own nation because they were the, quote, pro-slavery nation. And the North freeing the slaves and becoming, you know, it wasn't arguable anymore. They were the free section. So now that Europe was kind of like hands off. No, we can't. You guys are now definitely the slave F. Alright. So why did the Union prevail despite early challenges? At first, the South actually had better military leadership at first, but eventually we get guys like Ulysses S. Grant and General Sherman. Alright. And Sherman's eventual march to the sea, which you'll hear about in a moment. So we didn't start, the North didn't start all that strong, but it ended up that way. So the military leadership improved during the war. There you get Sherman. Picture there on the bottom. Okay, a very effective strategy by the North was the Anaconda Plan, and this will be more or less the extent of my military history of the Civil War. Basically, just a multi-pronged effort to surround the South and win the war. All right. One of the major victories in the war was Antietam, and I am pronouncing that correctly. Don't say it incorrectly, please. It's not Antietam. Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American battle history. Abe Lincoln, by 1862, actually wanted to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, but thought it would kind of seem like a hollow proclamation. You know, there was no teeth to it if it didn't follow a major victory. Remember, the first couple of years of the war, the North wasn't winning all that much. So he was waiting for a major victory to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. All right. So we win the North wins in Antietam, and shortly thereafter, Abe announces the Emancipation Proclamation.